I may say I feel very passionately about the need to retain fresh water supplies around the world, in aquifers and for populations. Now, I went to the World Congress of Soil Science in Brisbane last August, and one of the keynote speakers was saying the extent to which the water reserves of the world, the freshwater reserves, are dwindling, and that's one very great concern, even for Australia, especially during droughts. And the second one is the loss of agricultural land around the world. More and more agricultural land is being lost for whatever reason. And so I believe in Australia we have a very rich resource, especially across the Darling Downs and the Liverpool Plains, of highly productive soils that should be retained for that. So I believe there should be a moratorium about development of those areas for coal seam gas, and especially there should be no coal mining. And I'll give you an example now. The first slide shows us an area of Felton where they're planning to have the Ambre Energy project. You can see already there's some wonderful crops growing there. Can you imagine this being turned into a coal mine, and then how on earth can that ever be returned to agricultural production afterwards? I think it's never been shown on these black cracking clay soils, and until such time as it can be shown they can be returned to agriculture, it should be left as it is, as prime agricultural land for Australia. And to give you an idea of the extent of the gas fields, all these red dots, they start I think from Toowoomba, heading up towards Taroom, towards Theodore. I notice a fair number near Injune as well. These are all the proposed coal seam gas exploration areas at the moment. Now go to the bottom right hand corner, that's the area of the Darling Downs. That's the area I believe should be retained for prime agricultural production. If you have some which potential further west, further north, then the same also goes for exploration permits. I think this one might be for petroleum, and you can see that they're right across the prime agricultural areas, which are the green areas, as well as elsewhere. And similarly on the next map, I think this shows the coal. You see the greatest coal exploration areas are actually across areas like the Darling Downs where it's dark green. I believe there should be a moratorium certainly on the best agricultural areas where they also have good water supplies and adequate rainfall for winter and for summer crops. And the same goes for the Liverpool Plains area. So the next slide I think gives you an idea just from the Felton area of how many paddocks there are. You can imagine the variety of crops that are grown there, horticultural crops. There's a very large chicken farm right next to the area that Ambre Energy plan to mine. That's one example. The intensive agriculture, and also it's very closely settled. Now then, I believe near Wandoan, the proposed coal mine there is going to be larger than the actual total mining area of the Hunter Valley. Now interestingly, on these aerial photographs, the coal mining area is actually shown as white by reflectance, but you can see all those coal mines there, and we were aware already of the problems of dust and pollution and so on in the Hunter Valley, and health problems. Do we want to see those in a large area such as Wandoan on a large scale? I believe we don't. The next slide of course shows what's already happening at the Ackland coal mine. Now this is a small part of a much larger planned development. Already there are problems with coal dust. Already there are problems with coal dust coming through Toowoomba. So we'll continue on to the next slide, and this gives you an impression again of a coal seam gas pipe network right next to another mine area as well, not far from Dalby. So I asked the questions, first of all, with the coal seam gas water there's a problem of salt. They're talking of possibly 200 tonnes a day of salt coming through with the coal seam gas water across that vast area you saw. No one knows what to do with this salt. And the best way to contaminate land is to increase the salinity, whether it's from bicarbonates or chlorides or whatever. The next point about the agricultural soils, which you see in the next slide, is that, which is the one with the blue lines, shows us that the nutrients are mostly concentrated close to the surface. So unless you can be sure that that surface soil can be returned, as again as a nice layer of the top 4 inches, separately from the subsoil, you may well end up with the infertile subsoil becoming the topsoil, and then you've lost much of your agricultural production. Just to give you an example now of one of the soils, that's an Irving clay, about 1.6 to 1.8 metres deep, very rich agricultural soil, very high water holding capacity, very high clay content. the specialised agricultural soils such as you find across the Darling Downs and again in the Liverpool Plains area. Now I'll come back to salt, and the next slide shows us an estimate at the moment for the Condamine Boulogne of the total amount of salt in the area at the moment. You can see there's a small green section for the salt in the groundwater, the blue section of what comes in rainfall. Then there's a minimal estimate of the extra salt in the brown segment, and there's an example of the shaded line which shows that there could be maybe three times as much salt generated through the coal seam gas water as is received already in the rainfall and groundwater. So again, I'm calling for moratorium, because if you have a look at the next slide, this shows what effect salt can have on a landscape with the dead trees and so on and so forth. That will become virtually useless for agricultural and even forestry production. So again, I ask the big question, until such time as we understand our aquifers, until we understand more about managing the salt, I believe that there should be a moratorium on more developments, and especially I believe that the prime agricultural soils of the Darling Downs and Liverpool Plains should not be mined for coal. You might say if we can have areas reserved as national parks, then there should certainly be areas reserved for pressurised agricultural production. It's not a large area of Queensland, it's not a large area of Australia. Let's preserve it to feed the world and make sure we retain fresh water supplies, make certain we retain our best agricultural soils for the future. Not only to feed Australia, but also to feed the world. So in a balanced economy, you'd have your agricultural production and exports, as well as this rush into coal and coal seam gas.